I've been saying this for a long time, but it still surprises people. Log4j, as of today, between 35 and 38% of the downloads of Log4j will be of the vulnerable versions.
Still?
Still, it flatlined. It there was a huge spike in the adoption of the newer versions in
Right.
the weeks following, and we were pretty optimistic, but then it flatlined at about 60 to 68% of the good stuff leaving,
What do
somewhere
you
around 30.
attribute that to?
People don't understand what's in their software. They don't manage their supply chain.
Well, I am back live from the Dev Interrupted Dome at DevOps Enterprise Summit. It's a lot of Ds. And I've got two incredible guests joining me today on the podcast. Welcome, first of all, Brian Fox. You are the CTO of Sonatype.
Thanks for having me.
Really stoked to have you here. We've got a really exciting state of software supply chain report to dive into that I know Sonatype has just released your 8th edition. Is that
That's
correct?
correct. Yep.
Fantastic. And I know your colleague, Stephen Magill, the VP of Product Innovation at Sonatype, just did a plenary discussion on this as well.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you.
This is going to be great. We're going to dig
Happy to be
in,
here.
get some detail, give the audience some context into some of the exciting stuff that's been happening at Does. But before we get into it, I do want to give the audience a chance to get to know you both a little bit. So, Brian, why don't we start off with you? How did you end up at Sonatype? You're the CTO. What's your background?
I'm one of the co-founders at Sonatype, actually.
Fantastic.
My background is in software development. I did a lot of open source Java for a long time, was pretty involved in the Apache Maven project for a number of years. I was the chair of the project for a while as well. So I'm still involved in the day-to-day of the Apache Software Foundation. I'm
That's
also
awesome.
a governing board currently at the Open Source Security Foundation as well.
So you have a lot of free time, I take it.
Yep,
Yeah.
lots of free time.
Yeah, you're never busy. Yeah. Well, thank you for making time to come on the podcast.
Yeah,
We're
you're
excited to
welcome.
have you here. And Stephen, what about yourself? VP of Product Innovation is a cool title. How'd you get it?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I love the product innovation role. I'm basically leading a research team that's developing new technology and capabilities can feed into Sonatype's products, but also doing community research, like for the software supply chain report that we're going to be talking about today. I ended up at Sonatype after I founded a company called MuseDev that Sonatype acquired a couple of years ago. Just I've always respected what Sonatype does and their role in the community and the products that they produce. Even before I joined Sonatype, I was collaborating with them on the report. And going back as far as 2019, I've been sort of at least an outside consultant on the research.
So
in
you've
that
been a
report.
partner for a while, and
Yeah.
it just made sense, it sounds like.
Yeah.
How big is Sonatype now?
We're probably over 700 employees at this point.
That's fantastic.
It's getting
It's
quite
a huge
large.
testament
Yes.
to your work.
Yes.
And I'm guessing that as you've seen that organization grow, you've had challenges that have come with it. Has there been anything that you've seen either at DevOps Enterprise Summit or within the industry where you're identifying, okay, here's something we need to work on within our engineering team, or here's a goal for us around maybe DORA metrics or something else that you're taking away?
Um, yeah, I mean, every organization has its challenges
Always.
scaling.
Yeah.
We grapple with all of those things. Fortunately, I spend my time looking more at the industry trends, trying to help other people get better. Usually we're dog fooding and following our own best practices. But I think the challenges with managing the supply chain start to come in when you get bigger, when you get towards where we are.
Yeah.
But certainly much larger organizations have a much harder time dealing with it as well.
And so it sounds like that's a big focus of your work, Stephen, and your team and around the product innovation side is how do we solve these scaling challenges and then that dive into what does it mean for our software supply chain? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, that's right. We really look across the software stack, the development process, looking at the code developers are writing, and also the open source libraries that they're bringing in, everything that goes into modern applications. And then, we try and find best practices, evaluate sort of common wisdom and see, what what passes the sniff test when you line it up against real world data. We try and be data driven in all of the analysis we do in the report. And I think that's sort of one of the key values of the report is we get to do some sort of deep dive each year on some new aspect of open source risk management and learn something new.
I appreciate that you're both talking about applying this to the real world because I think it's really easy with some of this academic research style of reports to go, oh, we're just aggregating the data and ignoring the real world challenges and the context of different organizations and how they deal with things. So I love that that's something you're thinking about and considering. But let's give some context to the audience about this year's report. It just came out, as my understanding.
Mhm.
What's in the report? What should they know?
So a little bit of background first. Sonatype has always been the company that runs what's called the Maven Central Repository. This is where basically all of the world's open source Java is. And so that gives us really unique insights into behavioral patterns, download statistics that most other people don't have the ability to see. And for that reason, we've been building products and services to help people solve this problem for well over a decade. We founded the company 15 years ago, but we really saw the supply chain problem before the word supply chain were
Yeah,
understood within the software context. And we've been speaking about it for a long time. It's been frustrating,
I can imagine.
and the fact that the world kind of now has generally accepted this term and starting to talk about it is a start, but it's just a start. So the supply chain, like we said before, this is the 8th year that we've done this, has looked at lots of different aspects of this. Previous years, you and Gene were doing research on, how do you quantify what a good open source project is, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the
Mm,
mean time to update. After that, we started pivoting a little bit more towards the consumer side, to try to find advice that organizations that aren't open source maintainers, how can they do a better job? And really, that's what a lot of the most interesting findings of this year's report were. So simple, maybe shocking statistics, right? Um, you
I
know,
love a shocking statistic. Let's go.
so I've been saying this for a long time, but it still surprises people. Log4j, as of today, in today's, I don't even know the date, October
October
something, 2022.
17th or
Yeah,
something. Yeah.
10 months after Log4j, today, between 35 and 38% of the downloads of Log4j will be of the vulnerable versions.
Still?
Still, it flatlined. There was a huge spike in the adoption of the newer versions in
Right.
the weeks following, and we were pretty optimistic, but then it flatlined at about 60 to 68% of the good stuff leaving,
What do
somewhere
you
around 30.
attribute that to?
People don't understand what's in their software. They don't manage their supply chain,
Right.
right? And so that's one high level statistic. The other one that is new in this report is that at the time, so we looked at all of the vulnerable downloads of Central going back what a year, I think
Yeah.
at least. And at the time the things were downloaded, 96%
Yep.
of them were of things that already had a fix available. Right? And so the thing that is troubling for me is that in the wake of Log4j, the world had a bit of a collective freak out that they said, "Oh my gosh, there's a
We need to fix
problem.
this. Yeah.
We have to fix this. We're using free software. They're volunteers," which people interpret volunteer to be amateur, not highly passionate, educated people whose hobby is not something other than software, that they do it during a day job and then
Yeah.
they go home and they work on it. So mostly maintainers are very skilled engineers. The world freaked out about that. But the real problem from that statistic I just showed is the consumers, the organizations that are pulling these things down are doing so recklessly, right? It's not that the open source maintainers haven't fixed the problem. 96% of the time they have, and people keep downloading it.
Hmm.
Right? So the collective freakout and the focus on funding and improving open source is solving that 4% of the problem. And it's going to take a long time. How long will it take before you educate the next level of engineers to do a better job in the future? How long will it take before we, provide tools and you've got this mountain of existing code that's out there. We're talking decades before these changes actually make a meaningful difference. And yet companies that are managing their stuff as a supply chain today are what 10, 15, 20% better at least than people who aren't, right?
Hmm.
So there are very specific things that people can do today. You don't have to wait for the world to solve the 4% problem. And that's the thing that just, I feel like I just want to scream it and shake everybody and say,
Yeah.
wake up.
Wake
This
up.
is real.
Well, I'm glad that you're both coming on the show to talk about this because it's very clear there's still an awareness problem and still an
Yes.
inability to kind of dive into this. And Stephen, I'm curious, like beyond this, what else have you identified as like, hey, here are major issues?
Yeah. So, one thing that we looked at, in addition to the consumption side that Brian was talking about is, the production side and, how might you go about choosing components that are maybe likely to have a better vulnerability history, right? So we were really interested in those dev practices, and this is solving the 4%, in some sense, but it's also making sure that those vulnerabilities that come out, that get patched responsibly, that's still work that you have to take on as a consumer, right? If a project is keeping up to date with security vulnerabilities, but it does it by releasing 10 patches a year that you have to apply, that's a burden on you, right? So we were curious, like, is there a way to try to predict which projects would sort of be lower overhead in terms of having more to respond to? And so to do that, we looked at some of these development best practices that are being pushed by organizations like the Open Source Security Foundation. Things like doing code review, implementing buzzing, signing releases, and sort of locking down the development process and the CI pipelines. And we looked at which of those practices are associated with better vulnerability histories, more secure projects. And so that was a really interesting analysis because it's very skewed. There's like 4 practices that are by far have the majority of the impact on the outcomes.
What are
Yeah.
they?
So see if I can remember them all. So code review
Makes sense.
was number 1, which was I think really cool because it's been sort of accepted lore in the development community for a while that code review is like one of the best practices you can implement to improve code quality. And so to see it validated by such a large scale study, we looked at over 30,000 projects
Wow.
in this study. That was really cool. Number 2 was not checking binaries into the repository. That's another sort of best practice. I think that makes sense. Binaries are a potential attack vector. There's no transparency, when you have binary components checked in. Another one was pinning dependencies, which I think shows the importance of dependency management, that's a huge portion of where the risk comes in.
Yeah,
From a supply chain
those two are
perspective.
related. If you're checking your dependencies into your source control,
Yes.
you're probably doing something
That's
not
right.
quite right. Right. So
Exactly.
I think those are almost opposite sides of the same coin.
That's right. Those
Yeah.
two go together.
Great
And
point.
then the fourth one goes together with code review, which is branch protection. So
Ah,
making sure that you can't actually push code until you've gone through
Right.
the review process. Yeah.
interesting. I think these are really compelling things to remember, not just for open source projects, but for enterprises as well. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
you brought this up earlier. Okay, great. Most of the open source projects have made the fix at this point, but 30+% of people are
Mhm.
still using the wrong iterations. What would you say to engineering leaders out there who maybe aren't thinking about their software supply chain or maybe not completely addressing it at this point?
Yeah. There's a number of ways that I like to attack this, but I bring it back to our physical goods and our expectations as consumers of things. We don't have the ability, most organizations don't have the ability to affect a recall because
Mm.
they don't know what dependencies they put in their software. That's why 30% of the consumption is still of Log4j
Yeah,
because they don't know what's in there. We would not tolerate that from our auto manufacturers or our plane manufacturers.
absolutely not.
Why do we allow that to be the case for our software? But yet that is the sad situation that we live in, right? And so I often go through, this table exercise when I'm giving a speech. I say, imagine I tell you about a new vulnerability today. Sometimes this happens. Apache Commons Collections text, the text module had one just 2 days ago. Could you, leader of an organization, tell me, are you using any version of that anywhere in your organization? Most people can't answer
Oh,
that question.
yeah.
And it's worse than that. Can you then tell me, are you using the vulnerable versions of it? Right? Because if you can't answer the first one, you certainly can't answer the second one. And then how will you be able to remediate that if you have no idea, right? Sending around 4,000 emails asking all of your developers, your team leads, are you using this component is not the way to respond.
Ineffective, and it creates a huge tax on your team.
That's right. And the flip side of this is the industry has centered around the concept of SBOM, a software bill of materials, and in fact last year there was an executive order for anybody selling software to the government to be able to produce the bill of materials, and that's great because it's elevated the conversation. My observation, though, in talking to prospects and other people in the industry, is that they're too focused on I need to produce this bill of materials because somebody else has asked me for it.
Not because it helps my team understand what's
Exactly.
wrong.
The
Could
bill of
be wrong.
materials is a means to an end. The understanding of all of your dependencies in your organization is actually what's important, because now you can start to take steps. You can remediate when you can answer those 3 questions I asked immediately. You can alert the teams about it. You can start to make important decisions like, why do we have, 10 different XML parsers? Why is our surface area so large? And without that information, you can't begin to really manage it. And so, bringing it back to the auto industry for a moment, what people are interpreting the SBOM mandate is like, let's imagine we said to our auto manufacturers, you don't have to do a recall. You just have to print out the list of materials that went into this thing and stick it in the glove compartment when you ship the car. Like, that's pretty ridiculous, right?
Probably not going to work super well.
It's not going to work very well. It's ridiculous on its face, and yet that's what so many people are focused on. They're saying, I just need to produce the bill of materials. They're not stopping and thinking, what should I be doing once I have that visibility?
So how do we realign the industry so that people are actually thinking about, oh, this is something that can benefit me if I take this approach throughout my organization?
Well, there's lots of studies. I think it was PNC today gave a great talk about how they've used some of the tools to do automated enforcement and governance, and kind of federate this problem down to the development teams, and how effective that has been. Right. So the answer is not necessarily centralized control. It's not the security guy coming with a list of mistakes for engineers to fight over fixing. It's building this deeply into your pipeline, and then being able to provide that information in real time to the developers in the context, right? And that's some of the stuff that you guys did at Muse before, that we merged, because you realized, that providing the feedback in the pull request was so much more likely to get fixed. I mean, you could
I'd
talk
love to
about
dive
that.
into that, because I'll say like PRs and code reviews are a big sticking point that we're diving into. So I'd love to hear about like how you've been approaching that.
Yeah. So at MuseDev, and now the technology that went into that is known as Sonatype Lift. It's a Sonatype product that's out there, integrates with GitHub. And the whole philosophy with that was that what you need to, if you really want to improve software quality, and you want to make sure that the sorts of errors that code scanning tools can detect, static analysis tools can find these things, you want to make sure those aren't getting into code. You need to be presenting them to developers at the right time and in the right context, right? And the pull request is basically that.
And to the
right?
right developer too.
Yeah, exactly. So like, if you point out, and so we pointed out issues as comments and pull requests. So, a developer submits a pull request, automated tooling runs. It's just a whole suite of tools to cover sort of various types of issues. And then those results get communicated to that developer who wrote the code shortly after they wrote the code, right? When it's still fresh in their mind. And I
You
think
reduce context switching that way.
that's right.
And
So
they're in the mode of effectively asking for feedback. That's the
Totally.
point of the pull request.
exactly right.
Right.
It's this great social process that you're hooking into. That's all about reflecting on the code, and whether you can improve it or not. And so I think it's super important to find the right way to introduce these things, and it can have a big impact. There's a story from Facebook actually where they had a new static analysis tool that they were rolling out across their mobile apps. Right, they wanted to eliminate crashes, so that, their mobile apps are written in Java and Objective C. If you get a null pointer exception, it crashes the app. Like, Facebook collects a lot of data, so they can tell, when the app crashes, we lose this much ad revenue from this user.
Right. So they can directly align it to ROI.
Right.
So they're like, we need to fix this. We want to roll out this tool across the organization. And they first did that by like running overnight and like submitting issues, to developers to fix, and basically saw all of them ignored, right? 0%. They tracked what they called fix rate, which is, how many of the reports actually get remediated and fixed. And it was 0, basically. And then when they integrated into the pull request system, it went up to 70% for the same issues,
Wow.
right? Same issues, just a different mechanism of delivery. And so I think that just highlights how important the right type of integration is.
That's right.
That's really fascinating. So I don't know if we've talked about this previously, but PR is an area where we've done a lot of research as well, because we've kind of seen that same issue of like, okay, like this is an opportunity, but it's also a sticking point in development processes.
Mhm.
We did an analysis about 1 million PRs with like several, I think over 10,000 teams that we worked with on this. And our data found that like this is maybe the biggest pain point in the process right now. We've done a ton of improvement on CI/CD, helping improve people delivering pieces. And to your point, it's about like software supply chain. There's huge issues here, and the PR process is where we can weed some of that out and but it becomes a nightmare in some orgs for developers of like, is this an effective review? Am I getting the context I need for my review?
right.
And
Yeah, and you don't want to overload that process, right?
No.
Like it should always primarily be about humans talking with other humans about code, right?
Yeah.
You don't want it to be just this stream of messages from bots, right? So you've got to balance those things.
Yeah, we've been trying to use bots in some ways. So like we have Worker Bee as part of our Linear Bee product, and what it does is it helps provide a couple of things to developers to say, hey, like let's help you find some time where it makes sense to review this code. So we have an estimated time to review function we've created. So if a PR is over, let's say 50 lines of code, we can say, oh, this is going to take you, we think 10 or 15 minutes, or it's going to take you an hour. And so we've started to do some of that. So it's like, okay, let's try to help improve the efficiency of the team around this. But it's really easy to go overboard with that kind of notification process. So I think that's been an important piece for us. We actually just released a free tool called GitStream, where the idea is like it lets each team to kind of define their rules for how they want to route their PRs. And one thing we've been trying, and I'd be curious to get your guys' take on this, is okay, maybe for some teams, they have a 2-reviewer process because it's like a high compliance area. Can we use an automated review for reviewer 1 and then have a specialized reviewer who we route this to for reviewer 2 to speed up the process and like lower the burden on the team? Or if it's something that's maybe it's only a documentation change, we can just have this be an automated review. We can say, looks good to me through this automated tooling. Does that kind of opportunity, do you think you could do something with that to say, okay, like, I'm wondering, I guess kind of spitballing here, like, could we identify, hey, there's a log4j vulnerability issue here, and we can kind of like scan to see which iteration you're doing and ping against another database to say, hey, like, is this up to date? Is that kind of thing where Sonatype's thinking of like, how can we sort of evaluate that?
Yeah. I mean, we're able to not just code quality, but the SCA if you've introduced a vulnerability, through a dependency change.
Yeah.
But I think some of the work we're doing right now is teasing out, making sure that you provide findings that are relevant to the code that was just changed, and not using the pull request as the place to dump all the pre-existing findings, because that's not helpful either.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a fine art to find that balancing act between paying down the technical debt and not overwhelming people at the same time. So there's a real challenge there. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but in addition to all this other stuff we're talking about, there are these rising attacks of intentionally malicious things, right?
More and more.
This year, so in previous years, it was thousands of percent off of small numbers, but this year it was another 600, and so the average is 742% every year for the last 3 years.
And it doesn't matter who you talk to, Gartner, Forrester, whoever, they're all like, oh, this is just going to keep going up.
That's right. And there's a ton of money behind this. There's some slides that I have and some statistics that have come from studies that showed that in 2021 the worldwide drug industry was like $650 billion. At the same time, cybercrime was $6 trillion.
Yeah.
Right. And
one was just $2 trillion a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And
it's predicted to get to 12 trillion in the next couple of years. Wow. Right. And so if you look at that in terms of, and that's the money that is invested into the bad guys.
Yeah.
That's the VC funds, if you want to think of it that way. That's a lot of money being poured into this, and they're all coming after us. And that's why you're seeing this rise of the supply chain attacks, because right now, so many of these companies like we're talking about can't even answer those simple questions I talked about. And so they're not even able to deal with the next part of it, which is the malicious attacks, right? And these things are exfiltrating data, they're stealing credentials, they're doing all kinds of things. And the thing that I try to really push on for people is to make them understand that their developers and their development infrastructure is increasingly coming under attack.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's important for people to understand, if they're not really getting why I'm pushing on this, if you're following sort of, let's say, a little bit of legacy practices and you're doing scans before you put things into production, before you release it to your customers, right?
Yeah.
That's a good thing. You should be doing that at least. But you're missing the attacks on the development infrastructure when that happens.
Well, to your point, they've shifted left on where the attacks are coming.
That's right. And so many of those attacks won't show up for those tools. So I date myself a little bit, but in the 90s, browsers were inherently vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right. And so just going to the wrong website could get you hacked. Right. And so the sophistication of those attacks at that time was fairly low. They weren't trying to pretend to be your bank. They didn't have to. They just needed you to get to their website and they could hack you. That's where we are right now in the sophistication of many of these malware attacks on the supply chain. They're using confusingly similar names, typo squatting, like we used to see in the domain back in the 90s.
Totally.
Back in the 90s, what they relied upon was somebody would go to this website, realize that this isn't my bank, not even pretend to be the bank, and then the person would just hit back, go figure out what they did, and move on with life, not realizing I just got hacked.
Yeah.
That's what's happening with the development infrastructure right now. And so a developer, uses an underscore instead of a dash. They get one of these components that's, exfiltrating data. It's not even most of the time a copy of the component it's pretending to be. So it's not going to compile. It's not going to run tests. It's going to immediately blow up on the developer. And because we're not even sophisticated enough to block most of those, they haven't been forced to be sophisticated enough to move to the next level.
But they still can, right? There's
But
social engineering they can do.
Right. And so what's going to happen is the developer gets that thing, they potentially have data exfiltrated. They go, whoops, this is the wrong dependency. They figure out their mistake. They fix it. They move on, check it in. Now your tooling that's looking for it when you go to push the release never sees that just happened on the development side. So you have no visibility that
it's all happened before it even gets to the checks.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, and worse, with so many organizations with developers working at home now, not all of them have perimeter defenses there. So some of these attacks that might not have actually been exploitable in an office because, the backdoor couldn't have reached in. At home, that may not be true.
We just can't rely on perimeter defenses anymore, right?
That's right.
You have to have defense in depth because otherwise, we all have a cell phone in our pockets or sitting around somewhere. We all have at least one laptop. We probably maybe have a home machine as well. And we're bringing on the road, particularly at a conference like this. I'm sure you brought a work laptop and you've got your phone. And there's the very basic stuff you're talking about that's a little more brute force of hey, we're just exfiltrating data. But there's so much more possibility and sophistication that's going to come. We've seen it with consumer attacks, right? Where it's phishing scams are huge and they return billions, if not trillions of dollars every year to these scammers. And that social engineering is being applied in very clear attacks on enterprises sometimes. And it's starting to come more so into what you're talking about here. But right now we're not even making them have to use it. We're just leaving these vulnerabilities out there in some ways.
Yeah. The low level of sophistication of the attacks that we're seeing right now is directly correlated to the low level of sophistication of our defenses against it, right?
Yeah.
It's a cat and mouse game. And I guess that's the summary of what I'm getting at. They will get more sophisticated when we do a better job of actually managing the problem. But right now it's easy pickings.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a shame because again, we would not tolerate it of our car manufacturer. We would laugh them out of the room,
Totally.
and to bring it back to, that collective Log4j freak out, right? The world was saying, we need to do a better job at open source. We need to give them money. We need to give them tools. Well, remember the Takata airbag incident, right? It affected many, many auto manufacturers. Now imagine if the response was not, we do a good job and we're able to tell you exactly which of your cars has this problem in which of the airbag spots and when it needs to be recalled, right? Instead, they said, nah, we're going to pay Takata more money to do a better job next time. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
That's
It'd be
literally,
unacceptable.
it would be unacceptable. And that is what we are trying to do right now as a response to Log4j as an industry. It's completely wrong. And this is why we're doing these things to try to educate people guys, this is shocking. As a profession, we have to do a better job.
Yeah.
Because people's lives quite literally are at stake. When hospitals get ransomwared, people die.
Oh, was it 2 years ago? There was the massive spate of ransomware in the UK that happened at our hospitals. This is something that is happening already and is going to continue to increase.
That's right. Mercy Hospital, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Hollywood Presbyterian was shut down. Yeah. And people died because they had to be moved from one hospital to another, or their ambulance was rerouted, and minutes matter in heart attacks and strokes.
Absolutely. Are there other big takeaways? So obviously this is a huge issue. I know you've got a ton of stuff you could dive into the report, but I'm curious what other key things you want to make sure our audience hears. Stephen,
I think
is there anything in particular?
The gap between that you were talking about, I think is a really good one.
Okay.
So we do a survey as part of the report every year, asking individuals in software at enterprises about their practices for managing open source, the sort of outcomes, their confidence and security around their open source, and it's interesting to see what comes back. There's sort of a lot of confidence in organizations' ability to remediate vulnerabilities that flow in through open source. which is interesting in and of itself, given, the scramble to address Log4j and how much effort that all was, right? So,
so maybe a
but
little too much trust in us actually getting it done.
a lot of maybe, unwarranted optimism there.
Okay.
But I think what was even more interesting this year was there was a clear difference between how managers responded to the survey and how individual contributors responded. And management, by and large, had a much rosier view of the organization's ability to deal with security issues. So, like, as an example statistic, managers were 3.5 times more likely to say that their organization could remediate a security issue in less than a day across their application portfolio. I don't even know why anyone would answer yes to that, because they're like, I'm trying to think of an organization that could actually do that.
Right.
But,
Right.
yeah.
But what was it that 68% of them said they could do it, and 68% of them had not been able to do it?
Right. And then
something like that?
68% of respondents said that they were confident that there were no vulnerable open source components in any of their applications, right? Which again is a statement. Like, how would you ever answer yes to that, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, when you look at the data, 68% of applications, have a vulnerable component somewhere in them. So those two. This is why every year
there's cognitive dissonance happening there.
Yeah, this is why we love to every year do a survey and then also do some data analysis and line the two up and just see where we're deluding ourselves, right?
Are there trends that you see coming where it's like, okay, yes, this is the 8th report, but next year we can already see this is going to be a bigger issue?
Well, the malware stuff that we've talked about for the last 3 years, we've been ringing the bell on that. In the last year or so, I think people are waking up to that. Log4j was not one of those. Log4j was sort of the old school, boring, not really a bug in the code, but a combination of a couple of things that have been there for a long time. But those are continuing trends. So it'll be interesting to see, a year on, how many practices have actually changed. I know it might have been the 2018 report when we last did this, but we used to ask people similar questions that you were talking about. How many organizations have the ability to manage their dependencies and have automated tooling? And, when we started doing this 8 years ago, it was in the teens, 15% or so. And the last one that I had seen was about 50%. That's growth. Also, would you be happy with your auto manufacturer tracking only half the parts in the car?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah, especially if they're like a avionics manufacturer too.
So is it a cup half full, half empty kind of thing? It's a little bit both. It's better, and yet we still have so far to go.
Okay. Yeah. I really appreciate the passion you're both bringing to this conversation, because I think you're not only driving home with statistics and examples, but really driving into things that we're seeing in the industry that even I think a lot of the leaders listening to this need to confront a bit of. I know we have an excellent group of listeners. I think you're all incredible. Don't worry. But I'm sure some of us have to address this or are working through a piece of this. Or maybe you're an engineering manager listening and you're saying, oh, I really need to work with my VP to make sure we're addressing this, because it does take organizational buy-in to do this. Like, a single team can't really fix the problem on their own. Is, I think, part of the challenge here.
Yeah. And it shocks me to no end, because I go in to prospects and have this conversation a lot. And I can't tell you how many times I've been at a company who is a physical goods manufacturer, like airplane engines or cars. And I'm like, guys, stop. Why am I having to tell you this? I know that you would not be in business if you did what you're telling me you're doing for software on the other part of your business. This isn't like just a software company saying, oh, now I understand how physical goods manufacture work. You are those people. Why are you doing such a terrible job of managing your software supply chain? I don't understand why that is the case. I think it's just the mindset of software is not the same as what's happened, with the physical goods. They've had much more time to mature their processes. Is the only explanation I can come to.
Yeah, and I think, they're maybe not used to thinking about things in such an adversarial way, right? Like, if you have a part from a supplier that's not up to spec, it's going to have some failure rate that's higher than you'd like, but you don't generally have to deal with suppliers intentionally trying to undermine your business.
That's right. They're not shipping you a bin of parts with a bomb in it, right? But that's what's happening with the malicious components, right?
Which just means they should be paying even more attention to the software side of things, right?
That's right.
Well, and I think to your point about physical goods, like a lot of the folks I have conversations with are SaaS businesses, right? And so there's some understanding the vulnerability. It's still challenges there. Don't get me wrong. Like, obviously we have an industry-wide problem. But with the physical good manufacturers, you're seeing this secondary transformation that's kind of sweeping them too, where Industry 4.0 is happening. And a lot of their factories, a lot of the work they're doing is becoming IoT enabled. And
Mhm.
so you're creating more and more endpoints where you could potentially have vulnerabilities, potentially have issues. And so it starts to seep back into, let's say, and we've been using the example of a parts manufacturer for cars. Like there are more vulnerabilities now that are potentially going to be impacting their supply chain as well.
Yes, that's why I'm increasingly saying to them, "What are you guys doing?
Yeah.
You're literally taking, the worst practice over here, and now you're putting it on a chip or a piece of software or firmware and sticking it in the car, where
Yeah.
every single one of the parts that went into that thing, probably onto the actual circuit that is running this. Why don't you know the software that's running on that thing?"
And cars are giant computers today,
That's
more
right.
increasingly so too. Like,
That's
and
right.
that's what we want. Like, if I'm gonna go
And
buy
connected.
very connected, yeah. Well, this has been a very uplifting conversation, gentlemen.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate the context and the data you've brought to this. I'm sure some of our listeners would love to dive deeper in the report, get some more information. Maybe what would be the best place for them to learn more and maybe read the report themselves?
Sure. There's a banner at the top of our site, sonatype.com.
Perfect.
But if you search for Sonatype and the state of the software supply chain, you'll find it.
Come up
It's
pretty
out there.
quick. Yeah.
It's every year it gets a lot of links and a lot of data. People referring to it. So,
I'm sure your SEO team loves that.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
you can find it. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen, Brian, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule here at DevOps Enterprise Summit to join us on the Dev Interrupted podcast. It's been a distinct pleasure. I do have to do our little shout out to listeners. I'm going to look straight at camera for this one because I gotta talk to you. Y'all, I really try to do this every time, but we very much appreciate your review on Apple Podcasts. Like it means the world to me. Hopefully it means the world to Brian, Stephen too. They're going to back me up on this. But your reviews on Apple Podcasts or Spotify mean the world to us because they help us and help enable us to get incredible guests like Brian and Stephen be interested to realize that this podcast has a devoted listenership. And it's also a big deal for me personally. So if you could give us a review, it'd mean the world. Even if you're just saying, hey, 5 stars, definitely 5 stars. Like I love listening to this. I love the Does episodes. I love this episode. Doesn't have to be long. Take 30 seconds. You could do it right now as you're finishing watching this on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts. It'll help us a ton. Thanks so much for coming on, y'all.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.